The chatter of the high society gala quieted the moment Victoria Delacroix stepped onto the grand staircase. She descended with deliberate grace, her diamond-studded gown shimmering under the chandelier's light. Ethan Caldwell, standing at the base of the stairs, offered a polite but knowing smile. Tonight was supposed to be theirs, a celebration of their engagement, a showcase of their status as the power couple of New York. But Victoria's smile was sharp, almost cruel, as she reached him. "Ethan," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear, "we need to talk." The hum of polite conversation resumed around them as Victoria grabbed his arm and led him to a quiet corner of the ballroom. Ethan noticed the curious glances but ignored them. Whatever was on Victoria's mind could wait until after they dazzled their guests. "Victoria, what are you doing?" he hissed as they stopped near the balcony doors. She turned to him, her icy blue eyes locking onto his. "I'm leaving," she said simply. Ethan blinked. "Leaving?" "Yes. Tonight. Now," she added, her tone devoid of regret. "This is over." Ethan's jaw tightened. He glanced around to ensure no one was close enough to hear, then leaned in. "You're joking." "I'm not," Victoria said with a shrug. "Let's not make this more dramatic than it needs to be." The weight of her words hit him like a blow to the chest. Ethan, the man who always had control, felt it slipping through his fingers. "Why?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Victoria laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Oh, Ethan, did you really think this was going to last? You're good at making deals, but love?" She shook her head. "You're as cold as your penthouse view." "I gave you everything," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a growl. "The ring, the lifestyle, the future. And I want more than being a trophy," Victoria interrupted. "You want the truth? I've been seeing someone else. Someone who knows how to make me feel alive." The blood drained from Ethan's face. "Who? Does it matter?" Victoria asked, her tone almost bored. "He's everything you're not." Ethan felt the room closing in, the weight of humiliation already pressing on his chest. "You're leaving me for another man? Here, tonight?" Victoria smiled. "I thought you'd appreciate the efficiency." Before Ethan could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him frozen in place. Moments later, he watched as Victoria exited the ballroom, her arm linked with a man he vaguely recognized, an investment banker whose smug grin lit a fire in Ethan's chest. The murmurs around the room grew louder. Ethan could feel the eyes of his peers boring into him, their whispers filled with curiosity and schadenfreude. He straightened his tie and forced a neutral expression onto his face, but inside, his emotions churned violently. He stepped outside to the balcony, needing air. The city skyline stretched before him, its glittering lights a cruel contrast to the darkness settling in his chest. Ethan Caldwell, the man who had everything, had just been reduced to a punchline. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. And Ethan hated being powerless. That night, as the party continued without him, Ethan sat in his study, a glass of bourbon untouched on his desk. His mind raced, replaying Victoria's words over and over. She was right about one thing. Love wasn't his strong suit. But business? Business he understood. If Victoria thought she could humiliate him and walk away unscathed, she was wrong. He leaned back in his chair, a plan already forming in his mind. The media would soon be buzzing about the breakup, no doubt painting him as the cold, unfeeling tycoon who had driven Victoria away. Let them. He would give them something even more scandalous to talk about. His gaze fell on the stack of papers Maggie Hawthorne had left on his desk earlier that day. His secretary was efficient, loyal, and utterly unremarkable. The idea came to him in a flash, so absurd it almost made him laugh. Almost. If society worshipped beauty and glamour, then he would reject it entirely. He would marry the most ordinary woman he could find, a woman no one would ever associate with a man of his stature. He would show the world, and Victoria, that he didn't need their approval. And Maggie Hawthorne? She would be perfect. Maggie Hawthorne was halfway through organizing Ethan Caldwell's impossibly chaotic calendar when the man himself strode into the office, his presence like a storm rolling through a quiet village. Maggie barely glanced up, accustomed to his abrupt arrivals and curt demeanor. She had worked for him for 3 years, long enough to know when to stay silent and when to speak. This was one of those silent moments. Ethan stopped by her desk, his sharp gaze scanning her with an intensity that made her pause. "Maggie," he said, his tone clipped, "I need you in my office. Now." Maggie blinked, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell. Just give me a moment to finish." "Now," he repeated, already turning toward his door. Suppressing a sigh, Maggie stood and smoothed the wrinkles from her skirt. She followed him into his glass-walled office, where the Manhattan skyline loomed behind him like an extension of his power. Ethan gestured for her to sit, but Maggie hesitated. He was pacing, a sign that something was brewing. "Close the door," he said. Her pulse quickened as she did what he asked. Ethan Caldwell wasn't the type to mince words, and when he closed a door, it usually meant someone was about to be fired. Maggie braced herself, but instead of reprimanding her, he stopped abruptly and turned to face her. "Maggie, how long have you worked for me?" 3 years, she said carefully. "And in those 3 years, have I ever given you cause to question my judgment?" Maggie hesitated. The honest answer was yes. Ethan Caldwell's judgment was often questionable, especially when he was in one of his moods. But she wasn't about to say that. "Not exactly." "Good," he said, as if her cautious reply had been the definitive answer he was looking for. "Because I'm about to make you an offer." Maggie's brow furrowed. "An offer?" Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I want you to marry me." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the city outside. Maggie blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry. What?" "You heard me," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I want you to marry me. As soon as possible." Maggie stared at him, her mind struggling to process the words. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm not sure I understand. Are you serious?" "Completely," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. She searched his face for any hint of a joke, but Ethan Caldwell didn't joke. He was dead serious, which made the situation even more absurd. "Why would you want to marry me?" Ethan leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. "Because it's strategic," he said bluntly. "You're intelligent, reliable, and, most importantly, you're not part of the superficial circus I'm trying to escape." Maggie blinked again, this time more out of disbelief than confusion. "Mr. Caldwell, with all due respect, this is insane. You're my boss." "Not a problem," he said. "I'll have my legal team handle any potential complications." "That's not the point," Maggie said, her voice rising slightly. "Marriage isn't a business transaction. For me, it is," Ethan said coolly. "And before you start lecturing me about romance, let me remind you that most marriages in our circles are built on less than what I'm offering." Maggie stood, unable to stay seated any longer. "I don't even know what to say. This is completely out of the blue." Ethan's gaze softened, just slightly. "I know it's a lot to take in, but think about it, Maggie. This could benefit both of us. You'd be financially secure, free from whatever life you're trying to escape. And I'd have someone by my side who isn't constantly scheming to undermine me." She shook her head, trying to make sense of his logic. "But why me? Of all people?" "Because you're different," he said simply. "And because I trust you." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Maggie didn't know what to say. Trust wasn't something Ethan Caldwell offered lightly, but the idea of marrying him, marrying anyone under these circumstances, was almost too much to comprehend. "I need time to think about this," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "Take the weekend," Ethan said, his tone returning to its usual briskness. "But don't take too long. This needs to happen quickly." Without waiting for her response, he turned and walked to the window, signaling that the conversation was over. Maggie stood there for a moment, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm. Then she turned and left the office, closing the door softly behind her. Back at her desk, she sat down and stared at the half-finished spreadsheet on her screen. Ethan's words replayed in her mind. "I trust you." It was absurd, impossible, and yet, a small part of her wondered if saying yes might be the most logical decision she'd ever make. Monday morning dawned with an unusual tension in the Caldwell Enterprises office. Maggie Hawthorne entered the building, clutching her coffee, her thoughts preoccupied with the whirlwind weekend she'd spent deliberating Ethan's shocking proposal. Every logical part of her screamed to decline, but the memory of Ethan's calm confidence lingered. She had no illusions about romance, but she also couldn't shake the notion that this strange arrangement might offer an escape from her stagnant life. The decision weighed heavily on her as she rode the elevator to Ethan's office. When the doors opened, she immediately sensed that something was off. The staff seemed unusually subdued, their eyes darting toward her before quickly looking away. Maggie frowned, unsure what to make of the charged atmosphere. As she approached her desk, her coworker Elaine leaned in conspiratorially. "You might want to avoid social media today," Elaine whispered. "What?" Maggie asked, confused. Elaine glanced around before pulling up a gossip site on her phone. The headline screamed at her, "Billionaire Ethan Caldwell dumps socialite fiancé, proposes to secretary." Maggie's stomach dropped. "This can't be real," she muttered, snatching the phone to read the article. The piece detailed Ethan's breakup with Victoria Delacroix in humiliating terms, painting him as a cold-hearted tycoon who had abandoned her for a plain and unremarkable secretary. The article was filled with speculation and thinly veiled mockery, complete with an unflattering photo of Maggie from a company event. She felt the blood drain from her face. How did they even know? Elaine shrugged. "The tabloids have their ways. But if I were you, I'd be careful. People are already talking." Maggie barely had time to process this new disaster before Ethan's door swung open. "Maggie, in my office," he called, his tone as commanding as ever. Still clutching Elaine's phone, Maggie walked into Ethan's office, her heart pounding. The moment the door closed, she rounded on him. "Did you see this?" she demanded, holding up the phone. Ethan barely glanced at it. "Of course I did. I expected it." "You expected this? And you didn't think to warn me?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by her outburst. "Maggie, this is the price of being in the public eye. You'll need to get used to it." Her temper flared. "You've dragged me into a media circus without even giving me the chance to prepare. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" Ethan crossed his arms, his expression unyielding. "I told you this would be a business arrangement. Public scrutiny comes with the territory." Maggie took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "I haven't even agreed to this yet, and now my name is plastered across gossip sites like some kind of joke." Ethan's gaze softened, just slightly. "Look, I understand this isn't easy, but the media will move on as soon as the novelty wears off. Until then, we need to stick to the plan." "What plan?" Maggie asked, exasperated. Ethan walked around his desk, his posture confident. "We announce our engagement officially. We make a few public appearances to establish credibility, and then we let the story die." Maggie stared at him, incredulous. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," Ethan said. "As long as we stay ahead of the narrative." Maggie shook her head. "This is insane. You're asking me to uproot my life and become a pawn in your vendetta against, what, society? Your ex-fiancé?" Ethan's expression hardened. "I'm offering you an opportunity, Maggie. Financial stability, freedom from the mundane. You think I'm the only one benefiting from this?" She opened her mouth to argue but hesitated. Despite her anger, she couldn't deny that his words held some truth. Her current life wasn't exactly thrilling, and the prospect of financial security was tempting. But at what cost? "I need more time," she said finally. Ethan nodded, though his jaw tightened. "Fine, but don't take too long. The longer this drags out, the more chaotic it will get." Maggie turned to leave, but Ethan's voice stopped her. "And Maggie," he said, "don't let the tabloids get to you. They thrive on tearing people down. You're stronger than that." She didn't respond as she walked out, her mind racing. Back at her desk, she avoided Elaine's curious glances and buried herself in work, trying to drown out the noise both inside and outside her head. But by lunchtime, it was clear that avoiding the situation was impossible. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with messages, some from concerned friends, others from coworkers pretending to offer support while fishing for gossip. When she finally checked her inbox, she found an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "Think twice." Maggie hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single sentence. "Do you really know what you're getting into?" Attached was a photo of Ethan and Victoria, smiling at some glamorous event, the perfect picture of a happy couple. Her stomach churned. Was this some kind of warning? A threat? She couldn't tell, but the unease it stirred was undeniable. By the end of the day, Maggie felt like she was walking a tightrope over a pit of uncertainty. Ethan's plan seemed increasingly reckless, but something about his confidence made her wonder if he truly believed it could work. As she rode the subway home, avoiding eye contact with other passengers, Maggie realized she was at a crossroads. The safe path would be to walk away, to return to her quiet, predictable life. But the other path, however risky, might just be the change she needed. Maggie Hawthorne spent Tuesday morning navigating the labyrinth of whispers and sidelong glances that now seemed to define her workplace. The gossip had spread like wildfire, fueled by speculative articles that painted her as either a cunning gold digger or an innocent victim ensnared in Ethan Caldwell's web. Every conversation she overheard seemed to involve her name, her face, or her supposed intentions. By mid-morning, she couldn't take it anymore. She slammed her notebook shut and stood abruptly, drawing startled looks from nearby coworkers. Without a word, she marched to Ethan's office and opened the door without knocking. Ethan glanced up from his desk, his expression cool. "Maggie, to what do I owe this dramatic entrance?" "You owe me an explanation," she said, closing the door behind her. "This circus has gotten completely out of control." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her with the calm detachment of someone who had weathered far worse storms. "What, specifically, do you want explained? How did this leak?" she demanded. "You said nothing would happen until I made a decision, but somehow the tabloids know everything." Ethan gestured toward his laptop. "I've been dealing with leaks and speculation my entire career. Someone probably overheard something at the gala. Or maybe Victoria decided to stir the pot. It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," Maggie shot back. "I didn't sign up for this." "You haven't signed up for anything yet," Ethan reminded her, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "But if you're already struggling with a little public scrutiny, perhaps this arrangement isn't for you." Maggie bristled. "A little public scrutiny? People are treating me like a walking scandal, and I don't even know if I want to be part of your ridiculous plan." Ethan stood, his calm facade cracking just enough to reveal the frustration simmering beneath. "Do you think I enjoy this? Do you think I wanted my personal life plastered across the tabloids for people to dissect and mock? This is the cost of power, Maggie. You don't get to pick and choose the parts you like." Maggie opened her mouth to argue, but stopped herself. Ethan's words, harsh as they were, struck a chord. She had always admired his composure under pressure, the way he navigated crises with unwavering confidence. But now, seeing the cracks in his armor, she realized how much of that composure was carefully constructed. She began, her voice softer now. "I just wish you'd given me a chance to prepare." Ethan sighed, his posture relaxing slightly. "I should have. That was my mistake. But what's done is done. The question now is whether you're willing to move forward." Maggie hesitated, torn between her instincts to flee and the nagging curiosity about what might happen if she stayed. Before she could answer, there was a knock at the door. Ethan's assistant poked her head in. "Mr. Caldwell, your 2 o'clock is here," she said. Ethan nodded. "I'll be there in a moment." The assistant left, and Ethan turned back to Maggie. "Take the rest of the day to think about it. But understand this. If you agree, I expect you to stand by me. No second-guessing. No backing out." Maggie nodded, though her mind was far from made up. As she walked back to her desk, she felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her like never before. Later that evening, Maggie sat in her tiny apartment, scrolling through the endless stream of articles and social media posts about her and Ethan. The stories were a mix of half-truths and outright fabrications, but they all shared the same underlying message. Maggie Hawthorne didn't belong in Ethan Caldwell's world. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister, Emily. "Call me now." Maggie sighed and dialed the number. Emily picked up on the first ring. "What the hell is going on, Maggie?" Emily demanded. "I just saw your face on the news." "It's complicated," Maggie said, already regretting the call. "Complicated? You're apparently engaged to one of the richest men in the country. How is that complicated?" "It's not what you think," Maggie said, rubbing her temples. It's a business arrangement. Sort of." Emily was silent for a moment. "You're joking." "I wish I were." "Maggie, do you have any idea what you're getting yourself into? This guy, he's not exactly known for being warm and fuzzy." "I know," Maggie said, her voice heavy with resignation. "But he's not as bad as people think. He's complicated." "Complicated isn't always a good thing," Emily said. Just be careful, okay? I don't want to see you get hurt. I will, Maggie promised, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. The next morning, Maggie arrived at the office to find a package waiting on her desk. Inside was a sleek black dress, simple yet elegant, along with a note in Ethan's sharp handwriting, "Dinner tonight, 8 p.m. My driver will pick you up." Maggie stared at the note, her heart pounding. This wasn't just a casual invitation. This was a test, a chance for Ethan to gauge whether she was truly willing to step into his world. When the clock struck 8, she found herself sitting in the back of a luxurious black car, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. The driver pulled up to an exclusive restaurant where Ethan was waiting outside. He offered his arm as she stepped out, and for a moment, she hesitated. Then she took it, letting him lead her inside. The restaurant was everything Maggie had expected: opulent, intimidating, and filled with people who looked like they belonged in magazines. As they took their seats, Ethan leaned in and said, "Remember, appearances matter. They're watching us." Maggie nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up her menu. She could feel the eyes of the other diners on her, their curiosity palpable. The evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and carefully curated smiles. By the time they left, Maggie felt as though she had run a marathon. But as Ethan walked her to the car, he gave her a rare smile. "You did well," he said simply. Maggie didn't respond, but for the first time, she began to wonder if she might actually be able to survive this. Thursday morning began with an air of quiet determination for Maggie. After the whirlwind of the past few days, she had resolved to stop being a passive participant in Ethan Caldwell's plan. If she was going to go through with this, she needed to establish boundaries and make it clear she wouldn't be a pushover. The first opportunity came sooner than expected. She arrived at the office to find an urgent message from Ethan's assistant: "Meeting with PR at 9 a.m. Conference room C." Maggie frowned. Ethan hadn't mentioned anything about a meeting. Deciding not to let it rattle her, she grabbed her notebook and headed to the conference room. When she walked in, the atmosphere was immediately stifling. Ethan sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, flanked by a team of public relations professionals. They were all dressed impeccably, their gazes sharp and calculating. Maggie felt their eyes sweep over her, assessing, judging. "Good, you're here," Ethan said, gesturing for her to take a seat beside him. Maggie sat, her spine straight, trying not to let her discomfort show. "What's this about?" Ethan's lips twitched in a hint of a smile. "Damage control." The head of PR, a polished woman named Naomi Sterling, slid a folder across the table toward Maggie. "Miss Hawthorne, we've prepared a preliminary strategy to manage your introduction into Mr. Caldwell's public life. This includes wardrobe adjustments, media training, and a social media overhaul." Maggie opened the folder and scanned the contents. It was a detailed breakdown of how she was expected to present herself, from the brand she should wear to the way she should respond to invasive questions about her personal life. It was thorough, oppressively so. She looked up, her jaw tightening. "Wardrobe adjustments?" Naomi smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "We'll need to align your appearance with Mr. Caldwell's image. Nothing drastic, of course, but certain standards are expected." Maggie's eyes flicked to Ethan, who met her gaze evenly. "Is this really necessary?" she asked. "It's non-negotiable," Ethan said. "This isn't just about us. It's about preserving the company's reputation." Maggie bristled but held her tongue. She knew better than to argue in a room full of professionals who saw her as little more than a liability. Instead, she took a deep breath and forced herself to focus on the practicalities. "Fine," she said, "but I have some conditions." The room went silent. Even Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I'm not cutting off my family," Maggie continued. "I'm not deleting my social media, and I'm not pretending to be someone I'm not. If you want me to play this role, I need to maintain some semblance of my own identity." Naomi opened her mouth to protest, but Ethan held up a hand. "Fair enough," he said, "but understand that there will still be limits. Certain things will need to be adjusted to fit the narrative." Maggie nodded, feeling a small sense of victory. It wasn't much, but it was a start. By lunchtime, the PR team had left, and Maggie found herself alone in Ethan's office. She had barely started to relax when Ethan walked in, shutting the door behind him. "That was bold," he said, leaning against his desk. Maggie met his gaze evenly. I'm not going to let you bulldoze over my entire life. Ethan smirked. Noted. But don't mistake compromise for control. I still expect you to hold up your end of the deal. I will, Maggie said. But I won't be a puppet. Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good. I'd hate to think I misjudged you. Maggie wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a warning, but she decided not to dwell on it. Instead, she stood and gathered her things. Where are you going? Ethan asked. Back to work, she said. Unlike you, I don't have an army of assistants to do everything for me. Ethan chuckled softly. Touché. That evening, Maggie returned to her apartment to find another package waiting for her. This one was smaller than the last, containing a delicate bracelet and a note that read, Wear this tomorrow. We're going public. Her heart sank. She knew what going public meant, a carefully staged event designed to sell the illusion of their engagement to the media. It was the first major step in Ethan's plan, and there was no turning back now. The following day, Maggie found herself in the back of Ethan's car, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The bracelet sparkled on her wrist, a constant reminder of the role she was expected to play. Ethan sat beside her, looking as composed as ever. Relax, he said, his tone almost teasing. You'll be fine. Easy for you to say, Maggie muttered. You've done this 100 times. Ethan didn't respond, but the corner of his mouth twitched in amusement. When the car pulled up to the venue, a high-profile charity gala, he turned to her and said, Remember, confidence is key. If you look like you belong, no one will question it. Maggie nodded, though her nerves were threatening to overwhelm her. As they stepped out of the car, the flashes of cameras immediately blinded her. Reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into a chaotic cacophony. Ethan slipped his arm around her waist, guiding her toward the entrance. His touch was firm, steadying, and for a brief moment, Maggie felt a flicker of gratitude. Inside, the atmosphere was no less intimidating. The room was filled with New York's elite, their eyes assessing Maggie with thinly veiled curiosity. Ethan introduced her to a few key figures, his tone smooth and effortless. Maggie did her best to smile and nod in all the right places, but the weight of their scrutiny was suffocating. As the evening wore on, Maggie began to find her footing. She discovered that most people were too self-absorbed to pay her more than superficial attention, and the few who did engage with her seemed genuinely interested in her story. By the time they left, she felt a small sense of accomplishment. In the car ride home, Ethan turned to her and said, You handled yourself well tonight? Maggie looked at him, surprised. Thanks. Don't get used to it, he added, though there was a hint of warmth in his tone. The hard part is still ahead. Maggie nodded, her resolve strengthening. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, she wouldn't back down. Ethan sat at his desk late Friday evening, sifting through reports he had already read twice. The numbers blurred together, a meaningless jumble against the backdrop of his growing frustration. The gala had gone as planned. Maggie had been poised, charming, and altogether convincing as his fiancée, but the aftermath was proving less manageable. The media frenzy had intensified, with headlines dissecting every detail of their appearance. Speculation ranged from whether Maggie had undergone a secret transformation to fit Ethan's world to wild theories that she was a plant from a rival company. And while Ethan was used to such chaos, the sheer volume of attention was unprecedented, even for him. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Before he could respond, Maggie entered, her face a mixture of exhaustion and anger. We need to talk, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Ethan gestured for her to sit, though she remained standing. What's the problem? The problem, Maggie said, placing her hands on his desk, is that I just spent the past 2 hours reading articles about how I'm either your charity project or some kind of manipulative genius. And that's on top of the endless social media messages from complete strangers telling me I don't deserve you. Ethan raised an eyebrow. And you're surprised by this? Maggie glared at him. I'm surprised by how little you seem to care. I'm the one bearing the brunt of this, Ethan. You're used to it. I'm not. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her. This is exactly why I wanted you prepared. You knew this wouldn't be easy. Prepared? Maggie snapped. You threw me into the deep end and expected me to swim. Ethan sighed, his patience wearing thin. Maggie, this isn't a game. The public will always have an opinion, and you can't let it control you. I'm not letting it control me, Maggie shot back. But you don't get to dismiss my feelings just because you're used to living in a fishbowl. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, and Maggie could feel the weight of Ethan's gaze on her. Finally, he stood and walked around the desk, stopping just a few feet from her. You're right, he said, his voice softer now. I should have handled this better. But the truth is, I didn't expect you to handle it as well as you have. Maggie blinked, caught off guard by the rare admission. What's that supposed to mean? It means you're stronger than I gave you credit for, Ethan said. And if you're going to survive this, you need to keep proving me right. Maggie frowned, unsure whether to feel flattered or insulted. That's your version of an apology? Ethan smirked. It's the best you're going to get. Over the weekend, Maggie tried to distance herself from the whirlwind of their pseudo-engagement. She spent Saturday running errands and catching up with her sister, Emily, who remained skeptical of the entire arrangement. Are you sure you're okay? Emily asked as they sipped coffee in Maggie's apartment. I'm fine, Maggie said, though her voice lacked conviction. It's just a lot. Emily gave her a pointed look. Maggie, you don't have to do this. Whatever Ethan's offering you, it's not worth losing yourself over. Maggie sighed, knowing her sister meant well. I'm not losing myself. I'm just adapting. Don't confuse adapting with sacrificing, Emily said. Just promise me you'll walk away if it gets to be too much. Maggie nodded, though deep down, she wasn't sure if walking away was even an option anymore. Monday brought a new challenge. Ethan's legal team had scheduled a meeting to finalize the details of their arrangement, and Maggie found herself once again thrust into an unfamiliar world of contracts and negotiations. The meeting took place in one of Caldwell Enterprises' sleek conference rooms, with a team of lawyers seated on one side of the table and Maggie and Ethan on the other. The lead attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Victor Crane, began outlining the terms. The agreement stipulates a minimum duration of 1 year, Victor said. During that time, Miss Hawthorne will fulfill all public and private obligations as Mr. Caldwell's fiancée, including but not limited to attending events, making joint statements, and maintaining the appearance of a committed relationship. Maggie's stomach turned at the clinical language. And what happens if I decide I can't do it? Victor glanced at Ethan, who remained impassive. In that case, you would forfeit the agreed compensation and be held liable for any damages resulting from a breach of contract. Maggie looked at Ethan, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Damages? Are you serious? Ethan met her gaze calmly. This isn't personal, Maggie. It's business. Maggie clenched her fists under the table, forcing herself to remain composed. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. But I want my own lawyer to review this before I sign anything. Victor looked momentarily taken aback, but Ethan nodded. That's fair. Send me the name, and I'll have the documents sent over. The meeting ended shortly after, leaving Maggie feeling drained and more uncertain than ever. As she walked back to her desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing control of the situation. That evening, Ethan called Maggie into his office. When she arrived, he was standing by the window, gazing out at the city skyline. You were right to ask for your own lawyer, he said without turning around. It shows you're thinking strategically. Maggie crossed her arms. I'm not doing this for strategy. I'm doing it because I don't trust you. Ethan turned to face her, a faint smile playing on his lips. Good. You shouldn't. Maggie frowned, unsure how to respond. Ethan walked over to his desk and picked up a small box, which he handed to her. What's this? She asked. Open it. Maggie hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside was a diamond ring, simple yet undeniably elegant. You're giving me the ring now? She asked, her voice laced with suspicion. We're announcing the engagement officially tomorrow, Ethan said. It's time. Maggie stared at the ring, its brilliance almost mocking her. You really think this will convince people? Ethan's expression hardened. It's not about the ring, Maggie. It's about the story we're telling. And if you're not ready to play your part, then tell me now. Maggie swallowed hard, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She slipped the ring onto her finger, its cool metal sending a shiver up her spine. I'm ready, she said, though the words felt hollow. Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned away. Good. Because this is just the beginning. Maggie woke the next morning with a twisting knot in her stomach. The diamond ring on her finger felt unnaturally heavy, as though it carried the weight of her new reality. She stared at it in the dim light of dawn, wondering how she had gone from a quiet desk job to a looming press event that would place her squarely in the spotlight. She arrived at Caldwell Enterprises to find the atmosphere electric with anticipation. A makeshift stage had been set up in the lobby, complete with microphones and a backdrop bearing the company logo. The press, invited under the guise of a corporate update, buzzed with curiosity about Ethan's rumored personal announcement. Photographers milled around, testing their equipment and conferring with each other in low voices. Maggie managed to slip upstairs unnoticed, hoping to avoid questions until she felt steadier. She took a seat at her desk, only to see an email from Ethan's assistant summoning her to a final run-through. Gathering her courage, she stepped into the elevator and descended once more to the lobby. Ethan was waiting behind the stage, talking to the head of security. His eyes flicked toward Maggie the moment she emerged from the elevator. He handed a clipboard back to the security chief, then nodded for Maggie to follow him to a private corner. "Everything set?" she asked, her voice low. "Nearly," he replied, scanning the crowd. "Our PR team has the statement prepared. You'll stand beside me, smile at the right moments, and answer only the questions I direct to you." Maggie swallowed. "What if they ask me something I'm not prepared for?" Ethan's expression was calm. "Then look to me. I'll handle it." She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "Okay." The press conference began with a mundane overview of the company's quarterly numbers, punctuated by polite applause. Maggie hovered just off stage, heart thumping against her ribs. She could see a small throng of journalists checking their phones or whispering to each other, obviously waiting for the main story. At last, Ethan leaned forward and cleared his throat. "Before we conclude," he said, "I have one more announcement." His tone held a practiced gravity. "I'm pleased to share that I'm engaged." He gestured, and Maggie stepped out, blinking under the sudden onslaught of camera flashes. Ethan reached for her hand, guiding her close. "Everyone, this is Maggie Hawthorne," he said. "We look forward to a happy future together." The response was immediate chaos. A dozen voices clambered over one another, hurling questions in Maggie's direction. She tensed, remembering Ethan's advice. He lifted his hand slightly, and the journalists fell into a jostling but quieter hush. "I'll take a few questions," Ethan said, his voice resonating with the effortless authority he'd honed over years of public appearances. A reporter near the front raised her hand. "Mr. Caldwell, is this engagement related to the rumors circulating about your breakup with Victoria Delacroix?" Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "My previous relationship ended some time ago. Miss Delacroix and I wish each other well. I've moved on, and so has she." A second reporter piped up, this time directing the question at Maggie. "Miss Hawthorne, you're not from an elite background. How did you catch Mr. Caldwell's attention?" Maggie's throat tightened. She could practically feel the doubt radiating from the group, as though they expected her to stumble. But she forced a small, composed smile. "I've worked for Mr. Caldwell for a few years, and over time, we built a connection." She glanced at Ethan. "Neither of us expected it, but here we are." The cameras clicked incessantly, capturing every fleeting change in her expression. A third reporter tried to dig deeper, hinting at tabloid gossip. Ethan cut him off smoothly, directing attention back to the corporate angle. After a final round of photos, he thanked everyone for coming, and the curtain dropped on the press event. Maggie barely had time to exhale before Ethan steered her away from the throng of people. They slipped into a private hallway, where the clamor of cameras and questions receded. "You did well," he said, letting go of her hand. "You kept it simple." Her heartbeat remained rapid. "I felt like I was one step away from messing up." He offered the faintest hint of a smile. "Relax, Maggie. You handled yourself better than most people would." She nodded, a mixture of relief and lingering nerves settling over her. "What happens now?" Ethan looked past her, as though weighing the future. "Now, we endure the media storm. They'll speculate, dig up your past, look for any discrepancy in our story. Our job is to keep it clean and consistent." Her stomach churned at the thought of strangers scouring every facet of her life, searching for flaws or secrets. "I'm not sure how to handle that." His gaze returned to her. "You don't need to handle it alone. We have people for that." Just follow the plan. Maggie accepted his reassurance in silence, though doubt lingered. She wondered if there was a line between going along with the plan and losing her authenticity entirely. For now, at least, it was too late to turn back. They parted ways, with Ethan heading upstairs to finalize some company business. Maggie slipped outside for a moment of solitude, stepping onto the sidewalk that bustled with unsuspecting pedestrians. A few recognized her face from the press event and paused, pointing or snapping photos. Feeling exposed, she retreated back inside. By the afternoon, the news had already exploded across social media. Co-workers offered half-hearted congratulations, though Maggie detected the faintest undercurrent of envy and suspicion. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through an endless feed of headlines. Caldwell's new mystery woman, from secretary to fiancé, the unlikely couple. A few were more sympathetic, calling her the ultimate Cinderella story. She wasn't sure which angle troubled her more. Later, she found herself alone in a conference room, waiting for a meeting with the PR team. The weight of the ring felt more oppressive now that the world knew about it. A soft knock on the door made her look up. Instead of a publicist, it was Elaine from her department. "Hey," Elaine said, closing the door carefully behind her. "Just wanted to say congratulations." Officially, Maggie forced a small smile. "Thanks. I know things must be crazy," Elaine continued, her voice quiet. "But for what it's worth, some of us are actually rooting for you." Maggie exhaled, touched by the unexpected kindness. "That means a lot." Elaine nodded. "Hang in there. Don't let the vultures get to you." When she left, Maggie sank into her chair, her thoughts spinning. Perhaps not everyone was waiting for her to fail. Maybe, just maybe, there was room to breathe in this new life she'd stumbled into. Still, as the day wound to a close, she couldn't shake the sense that her carefully maintained composure was a crumbling mask, holding back all the uncertainty she refused to let the world see. For now, the spotlight demanded she keep up appearances, even if the truth was far less certain. She slipped the phone into her bag, determined to ride out the media storm. Tomorrow would bring a new set of challenges, more interviews, more speculation. But tonight, at least, she could breathe on her own terms. With the ring still on her finger, she walked out of Caldwell Enterprises, head held high, hoping she could learn to balance truth and illusion before it all came crashing down. Maggie checked her reflection in a tinted hallway mirror outside Caldwell Enterprises' executive suite, noting the tired eyes that revealed more than she cared to admit. The media pressure had doubled since the official announcement of her engagement to Ethan Caldwell, and people around the office treated her with a strange mix of fascination and wariness. She couldn't quite tell if their polite smiles were genuine or if they were silently judging her every move. Either way, her life felt like a precarious balancing act. She pushed open the door to a small conference room, where her newly hired attorney, Clara Watson, waited. Clara, an intelligent woman in her late 30s, wore an expression of calm confidence that contrasted Maggie's tension. Pages of legal documents were spread across the table, each one detailing the clauses of her agreement with Ethan. "Thanks for coming," Maggie said as she settled into a chair, her voice subdued. Clara offered a reassuring nod. "I've gone through every line of the contract." She picked up a page and tapped it lightly. It's standard for a high-profile arrangement, clauses for confidentiality, social obligations, and a timeline. But some terms are more rigid than I expected. "Are you sure you're comfortable with all of them?" Maggie exhaled, skimming the text she'd already seen. "I'm not entirely comfortable, but I'm not sure what my options are." Clara set down the page. "We can negotiate. Ethan and his team might resist, but you're entitled to revisions." Maggie's eyes dropped to the glittering ring on her finger, and she hesitated. "He told me it's non-negotiable. We've already done the public announcement. If I push back too hard, it might become a legal mess, and I don't want to fight with him." Clara studied her closely. "Just remember that you're signing away a lot of personal freedom. If you still want to go forward, I'll do my best to soften some conditions." A wave of gratitude washed over Maggie. "Please try. Even small changes would help." They discussed possible modifications, less stringent social media control, more flexible event obligations, and a clause protecting her right to privacy in personal matters. Maggie felt a slight sense of relief, even though she knew Ethan might see it as a challenge. She needed those boundaries, or she'd lose what remained of her own identity. After Clara left, Maggie moved through the corridors, heart heavy with the knowledge that each step took her further into a life she'd never envisioned. She headed toward Ethan's office, determined to address the contract. As she neared his door, she heard raised voices inside. One of them belonged to Victoria Delacroix. Maggie froze. Though she hadn't encountered Victoria face to face since the tabloids revealed everything, she recognized that sharp tone from the earlier gossip coverage. Cautious, Maggie inched closer, catching fragments of the heated conversation through the thick door. "You can't just pretend I never existed," Victoria snapped. "I have my own interests to protect." Ethan's response was too low to make out clearly, but the tension in his voice was evident. Something in the air felt dangerous, like the moment right before a storm unleashes its fury. Maggie's heart pounded. She contemplated slipping away, but curiosity, mixed with a flicker of dread, kept her rooted. Victoria's voice rose again. "This new stunt of yours will only work if you bury the truth. But secrets never stay hidden forever." Maggie felt a chill run through her. Was Victoria referring to some detail about Ethan's past? Or did she have information that could damage their engagement charade? When the door suddenly swung open, Maggie took a step back in alarm. Victoria emerged, her face a mask of barely contained rage. She paused for a split second, eyes sweeping over Maggie with a mix of disdain and cold amusement. "You've got your hands full," Victoria said icily, directing the comment to Maggie. "I'd watch your back if I were you." She stalked off, leaving Maggie standing there, shaken by the veiled warning. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his brow furrowed. He noticed Maggie's pallor and gestured her inside, closing the door behind them. "Sorry you had to see that," he said, the edge in his tone lingering. Victoria has a tendency to barge in when she feels threatened. Maggie's thoughts churned. Threatened by what? He hesitated, then leaned against his desk. "She's under the impression that our engagement is a direct insult to her. It doesn't help that some of her assets are tied to a business deal we once shared. She's worried I'll cut her out completely." Maggie folded her arms, her pulse still elevated. "She mentioned secrets that don't stay hidden forever." Ethan stiffened. "Victoria and I have history. None of it should concern you. Should I be worried?" Maggie pressed, unnerved by his evasiveness. He studied her, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "Not if we stick to the plan. The press loves a scandal, and Victoria knows how to play that game. She may try to stir up trouble, but she has no evidence that can hurt us, unless we give it to her." Maggie wasn't fully convinced, but she let it go for now. She cleared her throat and changed the subject. "I spoke with my attorney. She found some clauses in the contract that need adjusting." Ethan's face hardened. "The contract is straightforward." "What kind of adjustments?" "Mainly privacy protections," Maggie said, meeting his gaze, "and less restrictive language about public appearances. I'm not trying to sabotage anything, but I need some autonomy." He took a measured breath, as though reining in frustration. "I'll review any proposed changes. I can't promise I'll agree, but I won't dismiss them outright." Relief mingled with caution in her chest. "Thank you." They discussed a few more logistics, upcoming social events, the possibility of a small party to celebrate their engagement, the relentless calls from the media. Despite the undercurrent of tension, Maggie appreciated that Ethan hadn't outright refused her request. Maybe he was learning to adapt, too. That night, Maggie found herself sprawled on her couch, replaying every word Victoria had hissed. She tried to drown the unease in mundane tasks, flipping channels on TV without absorbing anything. With each passing hour, the pressure of living under public scrutiny weighed heavier on her mind. Was it truly worth the security Ethan offered? Her phone pinged with a message from Emily, asking if she was safe. The question made Maggie pause. Safe from what? She wasn't in physical danger, but she couldn't deny feeling cornered by forces she didn't fully understand. Maybe that was Victoria's intention, to plant doubt and watch it fester. Maggie glanced down at the diamond ring, catching a glint of the overhead light. For better or worse, she was tethered to Ethan now, wrapped in a story that had spun out of their control. Secrets loomed, questions remained unanswered, and Victoria's warning rang in her ears. Maggie wondered how much more she could sacrifice before she lost herself completely. Yet, as she finally drifted off to sleep, she clung to the small hope that whatever shadows lurked ahead, she might find a way to stand her ground without being consumed by the darkness. Maggie arrived early at Caldwell Enterprises the next day, feeling an unspoken urgency nipping at her heels. The lobby was quieter than usual, with only a few staff members exchanging soft greetings before slipping into private elevators. She headed for her floor, mentally cataloging the tasks awaiting her. Negotiations for the revised contract, follow-ups with the PR team, and a mounting list of events she was expected to attend with Ethan. Yet none of that felt as pressing as the lingering tension sparked by Victoria's cryptic warning. When she reached her desk, a sealed envelope lay on top of her keyboard, bearing no return address. Her stomach dipped at the sight. She glanced around, but there was nobody nearby who could have placed it there so surreptitiously. Opening it, she discovered a single photograph, Ethan and Victoria, standing in front of what looked like a private airfield. There was no date, but the casual familiarity in their posture suggested a history more substantial than a fleeting romance. On the back, someone had written, "You don't know everything." Before Maggie could process the implications, Ethan's assistant approached. "Mr. Caldwell wants to see you in conference room B," she said quietly, eyeing the envelope in Maggie's hands, but asking no questions. Maggie slipped the photo into her purse and followed, heart pounding a little harder than usual. She entered the glass-walled room to find Ethan already seated at the long table, laptops and files scattered in front of him. Several associates were present, including Naomi Sterling from PR and Victor Crane's legal team. The atmosphere held the formal hush of a high-stakes meeting. Ethan offered Maggie a curt nod. "We're finalizing schedules for upcoming engagements," he announced. "There's a fundraiser for an environmental initiative next week. We'll need to make an appearance together." He glanced at Naomi, who launched into a practiced overview of the event, the guest list, the media outlets attending, the charitable causes that Caldwell Enterprises supported. Maggie tried to pay attention, but her mind drifted back to the photo in her back. She recalled Victoria's parting words, hinting that secrets would rise to the surface. Perhaps this photo was only the beginning. Confronting Ethan about it here, in front of a half-dozen people, wasn't an option, so she forced herself to nod along as the meeting rolled forward, the details piling up like an endless to-do list. When the session ended, Ethan signaled for Maggie to stay behind. Once they were alone, he eyed her with mild concern. "You seem distracted. Is something bothering you?" Maggie hesitated. She considered revealing the envelope and its contents, but uncertainty held her back. "It's just been a hectic week," she said carefully, choosing her words to avoid a lie without spilling the entire truth. "The media attention is exhausting." Ethan accepted this answer with a thoughtful look. "It won't be like this forever," he said, though his tone was less convincing than usual. "We'll manage." She offered a tight smile and left the conference room, making a mental note to speak to him in private as soon as she found the right moment. Back at her desk, she discovered a flurry of new emails regarding the engagement. One was from Clara, her attorney, outlining several contract revisions the Caldwell legal team had preliminarily agreed to. Maggie felt a surge of relief reading through the changes, nothing dramatic, but enough to give her breathing room. Clara had managed to secure a clause protecting certain personal matters from forced disclosure, as well as a more flexible schedule for smaller events. Yet even this small success couldn't erase the unease provoked by Victoria's apparent meddling. Maggie half expected another message or a second envelope to arrive. She found herself glancing over her shoulder at every stray movement in the corridor, as though an unknown figure might be lying in wait. Her wariness only grew when, late in the afternoon, she bumped into Elaine near the coffee machine. Elaine greeted her warmly, then lowered her voice as she leaned in. "I was asked to deliver something to Mr. Caldwell earlier," she said. "A courier dropped it off, brown envelope, no sender info. Don't ask me why, but it fell off." Maggie's pulse kicked up. "Did you see what was inside?" Elaine shook her head. "Sealed tight. I just handed it to him. A few minutes later, he seemed upset. He even asked me to make sure no one else received anything similar." Maggie swallowed. The photograph she had received was still in her purse, and now Ethan had apparently been targeted, too. She recalled his cool demeanor in the conference room, how he'd noticed her distraction but said nothing about his own troubles. If this was Victoria's doing, or someone else's attempt to sow discord, it was working. She returned to her station, anxiety nibbling at the edges of her composure. If Ethan had something of his own to hide, he clearly wasn't going to volunteer it without prompting. She thought about confronting him directly, but the fear of pushing him away and jeopardizing the shaky trust they'd built made her hesitate. A few hours later, she found Ethan in his office, alone and scribbling notes on a legal pad. She stepped inside, closed the door, and placed the envelope with the photograph on his desk. "I got this earlier," she said, her voice subdued. "No sender, just the photo and that message on the back." Ethan's expression darkened as he turned over the picture. The tension in his grip was unmistakable. "Where did you find it?" "On my desk, this morning," Maggie replied. "Elaine told me you got something similar." He nodded, his jaw tight. "A different photo, but the same tone. Seems someone wants to remind us that the past doesn't simply vanish." Maggie edged closer. "What does it mean? Is Victoria threatening to expose something?" Ethan stared at the image, and for a moment, something like regret flickered in his eyes. "Victoria's capable of stirring trouble, but I'm not entirely sure she's behind these envelopes. She's more direct when she wants to hurt someone. This feels calculated, like whoever sent these is slowly building a case against me, or against us." The unspoken question hung between them. What else could be lurking in Ethan's past that might blow up this already precarious arrangement? Maggie steeled herself, realizing that every decision she'd made since agreeing to the engagement had tied her closer to a man with hidden complexities and potential liabilities. "So what do we do now?" Maggie asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. Ethan exhaled, setting the photograph down. "We protect ourselves. Keep an eye out for anything suspicious. Don't respond to anything that isn't verified. And if another envelope arrives, bring it straight to me." Maggie nodded, though her mind churned with possible outcomes. She wondered if this new threat would bind them together or drive them apart. The lines between pretense and genuine concern were blurring at an alarming rate. As she left Ethan's office, a heavy sense of foreboding settled over her. The secrets drifting around them felt like cracks in their carefully constructed facade, threatening to widen into a chasm that could swallow them both. For better or worse, they were in this together. And with each passing day, Maggie found herself caring less about appearances and more about the stark reality of surviving whatever came next. Maggie spent the rest of the day feeling like she was seeing shadows where there were none. Every sudden noise made her glance over her shoulder. She couldn't deny that the pressure had begun to weigh on her in a way she'd never experienced before. Even her small apartment, usually a place of solace, now felt like a stage where unseen eyes might be watching. She checked the locks twice before going to bed, telling herself it was just a precaution. The following morning, she arrived at Caldwell Enterprises earlier than usual, hoping to gather her thoughts in the relative calm before people filled the corridors. Yet, the moment she stepped into the lobby, the security guard on duty waved her over. "Ms. Hawthorne? Someone asked me to give you this." He held out a slim envelope, his expression uncertain. "They said it was urgent." Maggie's stomach lurched at the sight of another mysterious delivery. She nodded her thanks and slipped into the nearest empty office, shutting the door behind her. Opening the envelope revealed no photograph this time, but a simple typewritten note that read, "Don't play games you can't win. Back out now." Beneath it was a grainy printout of some kind of financial document with partial account numbers she didn't recognize. She stared at the note, her pulse racing. The message was shorter, colder. Whoever was doing this wasn't content with subtle hints anymore. They wanted her to feel threatened, pushed to the edge. She folded the paper carefully and stashed it in her bag, determined not to appear rattled when she faced Ethan. She found him in his office, leaning over a pile of spreadsheets and looking like he hadn't slept. The sight of him, usually so composed, rubbing his temples revealed more of his stress than words ever could. Maggie placed the envelope on his desk, careful to maintain a calm tone. "Another one," she said simply. Ethan flipped it open, and she watched his jaw tighten. "It's escalating," he said in a clipped voice. "They're no longer just hinting at secrets. Now it's threats." "It looks like some banking record," Maggie ventured, tapping the printout. "Do you recognize any of this?" Ethan's gaze flicked to the numbers. "Not immediately, but I can have my team trace it. The partial account number might be tied to a dormant fund or an old business deal." Maggie's heart pounded. "So there really could be a hidden skeleton in your financials?" Ethan frowned. Hidden is a strong word. I do have multiple investments and partnerships, some inherited, some formed over the years. It's possible that something was buried in old paperwork. She studied him, trying to gauge his level of concern. You never told me you might be dealing with questionable finances. This changes things, doesn't it? He set the note aside. I'm not involved in anything illegal, if that's what you're worried about. But the business world isn't black and white. Sometimes you invest in a venture without knowing every detail of the people behind it. Someone could be using a thread from one of those deals to pull at me now. Maggie crossed her arms, feeling a surge of frustration. You said nothing could hurt us if we stuck to the plan. That doesn't sound so certain anymore. Ethan exhaled heavily. I still believe we can control this if we work together. The person sending these messages wants to scare us into making a mistake. We can't let them. A tense silence followed. Maggie glanced at the door, half expecting someone to burst in with more bad news. I'm not backing out, she said at last. But I need to know what we're dealing with. I can't just keep waiting for the next threat to arrive. Ethan met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, there was an earnestness in his expression she rarely saw. I'll put my private investigators on it. If there's a link to any old associates or deals, we'll find it. In the meantime, keep an eye out. Don't engage with anyone suspicious, and let me or security know if you get another envelope. She gave a tight nod, gathering the nerve to walk back into the hallway. Before she reached the door, Ethan spoke again, his voice lower. Maggie, I'm sorry you're caught in this. It was never my intention. The apology, simple and sincere, shook her more than she cared to admit. We're both in too deep to look back, she replied, and left without waiting for a response. For the rest of the morning, Maggie tried to focus on her regular responsibilities. She answered emails, updated Ethan's schedule, and fielded calls from the PR team regarding an upcoming charity event. Each mundane task felt oddly comforting, like a reminder that despite the looming threats, life went on. By midday, she was buried in spreadsheets when a commotion near the elevator drew her attention. A tall man in a tailored suit strode onto the floor with an air of authority. Maggie recognized him as Grayson Mitchell, a high-profile private investigator rumored to be on Ethan's payroll. He cut a direct path toward Ethan's office, ignoring curious glances from employees. Clearly, Ethan wasn't wasting time on his promise to investigate. Around mid-afternoon, Elaine came by Maggie's desk. The guy who just showed up? He asked for you too, Elaine said softly. He and Mr. Caldwell want to see you in his office. Maggie nodded, bracing herself for whatever revelations might follow. When she entered, Ethan and Grayson were poring over a digital file on a laptop. Ethan gestured for her to join them. We've got a lead, he announced. Grayson thinks the partial account number might connect to an offshore venture. It looks like it was opened years ago by someone in my father's network. Grayson nodded, his expression neutral. It's not conclusive yet, but if this is the same fund, it's been inactive for over a decade. The question is why it's resurfacing now, and how it connects to these threats. Maggie leaned forward, scanning the data. Could Victoria be behind it? She mentioned secrets. Or it might be someone else with a grudge against your family. Ethan rubbed his chin. I'm not ruling out Victoria, but she'd typically use more direct tactics. This feels orchestrated, methodical, like someone has spent a lot of time gathering ammunition. Grayson closed the laptop. We'll continue digging. If we find a link between this account and an individual who stands to gain from exposing it, we'll know who's pulling the strings. Maggie's thoughts whirled. And in the meantime, Ethan's eyes hardened. We maintain our public image, do everything by the book. If they're baiting us, we can't show fear. She breathed out slowly, forcing the tension in her shoulders to ease. All right, I won't let them see me flinch. When Grayson departed, Ethan lingered, turning his attention fully to Maggie. Thank you, he said quietly, for not abandoning this agreement. Us. When things got dangerous, Maggie managed a subdued half-smile. I'll admit, I came close to running, but it wouldn't fix anything. Besides, this was never just about you, was it? I've got my own reasons for staying. He nodded, stepping aside to let her leave. If you need anything, protection, more space, anything at all, tell me. She paused in the doorway, struck by the realization that beneath the forced facade, they were forming a genuine alliance. The lines had blurred so completely she could hardly discern where the deal ended and something real began. Yet she refused to dwell on it too long. The threat hovering over them demanded her full attention, and any confusion about her emotions would have to wait for another time. By the end of the day, Maggie stood at the edge of the lobby, feeling the eyes of strangers who recognized her from the press coverage. She took a steadying breath and stepped outside into the late afternoon light. Each new revelation tightened the bonds between her and Ethan, making it all the more crucial that they trust each other. One thing was clear. The cracks in their story were growing, and whoever lurked in the shadows had no intention of letting them off easy. The thick clouds rolling over the city felt strangely appropriate as Maggie stepped out of the car the next morning. An ominous weight seemed to press down on her, a reflection of the unresolved threats circling her and Ethan. She clutched her phone tightly, reviewing yet another flood of notifications. Dozens of new headlines speculated on the identity of the anonymous sender, each theory more outlandish than the last. Inside Caldwell Enterprises, the tension was palpable. Employees offered polite smiles or quick greetings, but the usual buzz of productivity was overshadowed by hushed conversations that tapered off whenever Maggie or Ethan passed by. The air felt charged, like everyone was waiting for a revelation they could gossip about. With each step, Maggie half expected another envelope to appear, delivering some new, half-deciphered piece of the puzzle. She headed straight to her desk, only to find Naomi Sterling from PR lurking nearby, her tablet tucked under one arm. Naomi's usually polished demeanor was intact, but her brow furrowed with concern. "Good morning," Naomi said, her voice subdued. "Ethan wants you in his office. Something about the upcoming charity fundraiser." Maggie mustered a small nod. "Let me put my things down and I'll go." Naomi offered a brisk smile and left. Maggie slipped her purse into a drawer, her heart racing with the thought of more bad news. The ongoing threats made every request from Ethan feel like an emergency. Drawing a breath for courage, she walked to his office and knocked. "Come in," he called from within. He stood near the window when she entered, phone pressed to his ear. She caught a glimpse of the city's skyline reflected in the glass before he turned. He ended the call with a curt goodbye, then set his phone aside. "The charity fundraiser is tomorrow," Ethan said, jumping right in. "We need to finalize what we'll say to the press." Naomi's worried the tension around these anonymous threats could overshadow our sponsorship of the event. Maggie noted the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes, the subtle slump in his posture. "I can handle whatever questions come at me," she said softly. "But what if they press for details about the offshore account, or who's behind these letters?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "We deflect. Our statement is strictly about the cause we're supporting, environmental rehabilitation near the waterfront. If anyone tries to spin it, we politely steer back on topic. If they won't let it go, I'll cut the interview short." She studied his expression. "That's risky. The media might interpret that as guilt." A wry smile tugged at his lips. "They interpret everything as guilt. Look, I have Grayson on standby in case things escalate." His face turned serious. "But let's keep our guard up. We can't show any cracks." Maggie nodded, though her stomach churned with unease. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "Any progress on tracing those account numbers?" "Grayson thinks he's close," Ethan replied, his jaw set. "But nothing concrete yet. I'll let you know the moment we have a lead." She left, her mind rattling with possibilities. Could the saboteur be waiting at the fundraiser, planning to confront them publicly? Would Victoria Delacroix make another brazen appearance, fueling speculation? The unknowns were endless. Back at her desk, Maggie sifted through emails. Amid the usual queries from PR and the scheduling updates, she noticed a draft statement from Naomi. It outlined their talking points for the fundraiser, emphasizing Caldwell Enterprises' long-standing commitment to environmental causes, praising the local nonprofit partner, and concluding with a carefully worded note about how personal controversies wouldn't detract from their philanthropic efforts. Scanning it, Maggie felt a pang. Personal controversies. No one even pretended to call it a real engagement anymore, except in official announcements. Part of her wanted to laugh at the ridiculousness. Another part wanted to hide. She saved the file, then moved on to more mundane tasks in the hope of grounding herself. As evening approached, Maggie found herself at a small cafe not far from the office, having taken a rare moment to decompress. She stirred her latte absent-mindedly, replaying the last few weeks in her mind. The public reveal of the engagement, the sudden onslaught of threats, the creeping suspicion that their entire world was built on shifting sand. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emily, her sister. "Hey, you free for a quick call?" Maggie sighed, not entirely sure she had the emotional bandwidth, but guilt nudged her. Emily had been supportive, even if skeptical. She dialed, and Emily picked up instantly. "Maggie, I read the latest piece on the gossip sites," Emily said, concern lacing her words. "They're suggesting you're caught in some financial scandal linked to Ethan's father. Is that true?" Maggie pressed a hand to her forehead. "I don't even know, Em. We've received envelopes with partial account details, random threats. It's a mess. Are you safe?" Emily asked, her tone tightening with worry. "For now. Ethan has security, and he's hired a private investigator." Emily paused. "I just want you to be careful. If there's anything dangerous in his past, you could be the one left holding the blame. It wouldn't be fair, but you know how these things go." Maggie nodded, though Emily couldn't see. "I know. I'm being cautious." After she hung up, Maggie realized the sky outside had deepened into purple twilight. She gathered her things and left the cafe, the streets not yet fully lit. Each step home felt longer than usual, as if the city itself had grown wary. She caught herself glancing behind her whenever she heard footsteps echoing too close. By the time she reached her apartment building, she was drained from the constant vigilance. Safe within her own walls, she locked the door and flipped on the lights. The ring on her finger gleamed under the fluorescent glow, a symbol of all the complications that had taken root in her life. She set down her keys, tossing her phone onto the couch, and sank into a chair at the small dining table. Before she could settle, her phone chimed. Grayson's clipped tone echoed through the line when she answered. "I have a development." The offshore account was tied to a defunct partnership. It seems someone's using old documents to hint at money laundering, though the real story is more nuanced. "I'll fill you in tomorrow with Ethan." Maggie's breath caught. "Does it lead us to the cinder?" "Not definitively," Grayson said, "but we may have someone who profited from the account before it went dormant. I need more time to confirm." She thanked him and hung up, heart pounding all over again. Whoever was behind these threats seemed to have a deliberate strategy, each new clue designed to tighten the noose around Ethan's reputation. Their entire engagement, built on a ruse, was becoming overshadowed by shadows of a possibly criminal past. Curling up on the couch, Maggie stared at the silent ring. Once, it had symbolized little more than a business contract, her ticket out of a mundane life. Now, it felt like a binding chain linking her to a man whose secrets ran deeper than she'd ever imagined. Yet, despite the suffocating chaos, she couldn't deny that part of her refused to abandon him. Maybe it was loyalty born of adversity. Maybe it was the confusing blend of respect and something more that had sprouted between them amid all the lies. As midnight neared, Maggie rose and dimmed the lights. Tomorrow, they'd stand side by side at the charity event, facing the cameras and the questions. Another performance on the public stage. Another chance for their enemies, visible or hidden, to strike. In the quiet moments before she finally drifted to sleep, one stark truth grew impossible to ignore. With each shared secret, each fresh wave of danger, she and Ethan drew closer to a point of no return, where pretense and reality might merge into something neither had expected, and neither could fully control. The drizzle outside felt like a quiet warning as Maggie and Ethan arrived at the charity fundraiser. Camera lights flared in the gloom, capturing every hint of tension between them. Maggie willed herself to project calm, even though her pulse hammered from the mounting threats. The event space inside shone with glass chandeliers and carefully arranged decor. Guests milled about tables laden with brochures about the waterfront rehabilitation program, occasionally pausing to glance at her ring or catch a glimpse of Ethan. They navigated the crowd, greeting city officials and major donors, while Naomi, from PR, hovered protectively. Maggie recognized the usual dynamic. Each handshake carried an unspoken question. Were the rumors true? Would someone confront them? But Ethan exuded cool confidence, and Maggie clung to that steadiness. A slow wave of hushed voices spread across the ballroom. In the distance, Victoria Delacroix appeared at the entrance. She swept in with a flourish, commanding every pair of eyes that dared to look her way. Maggie's stomach twisted, recalling the last unsettling exchange with Victoria. Either she was here to support the cause or orchestrate a spectacle. With Victoria, it was impossible to tell. Before Maggie could question Ethan, Amelia Green, the event organizer, summoned them to the stage. Under the glare of the spotlight, they took turns addressing the audience about the importance of the Restoration Fund. Maggie focused on her lines, determined not to let a trembling voice betray her fears. Applause rippled through the hall when they finished, and the MC resumed, urging attendees to donate generously. Stepping off stage, Maggie's shoulders sagged in relief until she noticed Grayson Mitchell, Ethan's private investigator, standing near the far wall. He locked eyes with Ethan and gave a subtle nod. Ethan touched Maggie's arm. "We need to speak with Grayson," he murmured. They slipped behind a row of partition panels, away from most prying eyes. Grayson's customary stoicism showed a crack of urgency. "I've got a solid lead on the offshore account," he said quietly. "An old partner of your father's, Jefferson Lawton, has been using defunct funds to blackmail certain parties. It looks like he's the one sending the threats." Ethan's brow creased. "Jefferson Lawton died years ago." Grayson nodded. "Apparently, his son inherited everything, including old grudges. He goes by James Lawton now. He's been collecting debts and secrets tied to your father's estate. Once you and Maggie announced your engagement, it became the perfect pressure point. He's threatening both of you to gain leverage, and he's not above scaring Maggie's sister to get it." Maggie's stomach lurched at the reminder of Emily's photo in the latest envelope. "How do we stop him?" Grayson's gaze darkened. "He's here. I confirmed he donated under an alias, probably hoping to corner you in public. Security is watching him. But we need a direct confrontation if we're going to end this." Ethan exhaled, anger simmering beneath his calm. "Show me where he is." Grayson led them through a side corridor into a dimly lit lounge area, where a tall, lean man stood sipping champagne. At first glance, he looked like any other affluent donor, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that signaled hidden motives. When he spotted Ethan and Maggie, he smirked, as if acknowledging the inevitable showdown. "You finally caught on." His voice was low, condescending. "I've been busy unearthing every filthy secret your father left behind." Ethan's expression turned steely. "If you have evidence of wrongdoing, you bring it to the authorities. Threatening Maggie's sister is unacceptable." James shrugged. "Your father ruined mine, forced him into desperation. The illegal deals came from your family's circle. I'm just collecting what's owed." Maggie tightened her grip on Ethan's arm, refusing to be intimidated. "Stay away from my family." James tilted his head, eyes gleaming. "Or what? You'll expose me? You're both tangled up in this. The tabloids would love to know about your business arrangement. What's that worth to you?" Ethan stepped forward, fury edging his words. "We're not playing your game." Behind them, Grayson signaled discreetly to building security, who edged closer. James raised an eyebrow as two guards approached. "You can't arrest me for telling the truth." "Maybe not," Grayson said grimly, "but you can be detained for harassment and blackmail attempts when we turn over the evidence we've collected. Emails, financial records, messages you sent." A flicker of uncertainty crossed James's features. He glanced around, realizing his cornered position. Then, with a sneer, he tried to slip past Maggie. Ethan blocked him. Another guard stepped in, calmly but firmly escorting James out. In the sudden quiet, Maggie let out a shaky breath. "Is this over?" Ethan slipped an arm around her shoulders, relief mingling with lingering tension. "Once we hand everything to the authorities, it should be. He has no real power without secrecy. We'll make sure he can't hurt you or your sister again." Grayson nodded. "I'll oversee the handoff to the police. You two need to finish the night with composure. Let the fundraiser end smoothly." They emerged back into the main hall, where guests still mingled, mostly unaware of the brief confrontation. Victoria hovered near the bar, watching them with a curious tilt of her head. For once, there was no smugness on her face, just a silent acknowledgement that something significant had transpired. An hour later, final pledges poured in, and the event concluded successfully. Amelia offered her gratitude, and the crowd dispersed in high spirits, oblivious to the drama that had nearly overshadowed the cause. As Maggie and Ethan stepped outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the city lights. In the subdued glow of passing headlights, Maggie turned to Ethan. "We survived tonight," she murmured, exhaustion tinging her voice. He studied her for a long moment. "We did. And now, maybe we can move past all these threats." She laced her fingers with his, the ring on her hand catching a stray beam of light. "What about our arrangement?" she asked softly. "Do we keep up appearances, or—" Ethan pressed his lips into a thoughtful line. "I think we decide what we really want. This whole plan was supposed to be a business transaction, but after everything we've gone through," he exhaled, vulnerability clear in his gaze. "If this is just a contract, we can end it. But if there's something real here—" A hint of hope fluttered in Maggie's chest. "I don't want to live a lie anymore. Not for revenge. Not for show." He brushed his thumb across her cheek. "Neither do I." They lingered in the hush of the street, free from watchful cameras, no longer forced to pretend. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, the shadow of blackmail had lifted. Past burdens couldn't vanish overnight, but they could face them side by side, this time as partners, not mere players in a fabricated romance. When Ethan led Maggie to the waiting car, she felt a sense of closure settling over them. Threats had been quelled, the orchestrator unveiled. What remained was a choice entirely their own, to walk away or to truly embrace a future that no tabloid headline could define. And as the city lights shimmered behind them, Maggie allowed herself the quiet assurance that sometimes, even from a tangled beginning, a genuine bond could emerge, one built not on illusions, but on the courage to stand together until the final curtain call.